The bus gave a sputtering sigh as it rolled away from the curb, leaving behind a gray mist of exhaust and a girl who wasn't ready to be seen. Zariah Miles stood at the bottom of the steps of Meriwether High, her shoulders tight beneath the oversized hoodie she always wore like armor. The Pennsylvania air was sharper than she was used to, back in Georgia. Even the mornings had weight, warmth, and rhythm. But here, everything felt muted, cold, like the atmosphere itself was trying to erase her. One hand gripped the strap of her backpack, the other clutched the handle of her violin case. It was black, once glossy, now matte with time. The corners were wrapped in duct tape, and a small etching near the latch read, RM, her father's initials. She never let it touch the ground, never handed it to anyone else. That case wasn't just carrying an instrument. It carried memories, silence, grief, and the only piece of her father that hadn't been boxed up after the funeral. Zariah didn't like first days, not because of the anxiety. She had learned to live with that, like a second shadow. What she hated was a performance, the stares, the names on roll call that teachers paused over, the looks that scanned her from top to bottom and decided exactly where she belonged before she ever opened her mouth. So she stopped opening her mouth. At her last school, she made it almost 6 months without ever answering a question in class. She turned in every assignment, got perfect grades. And yet, when she left, none of the teachers remembered her name. Just a girl with the violin. Quiet, uncomplicated, replaceable. She liked it that way. Merely surviving a place meant not being noticed in it. She stepped through the double doors into a sea of fluorescent lights, polished linoleum, and the constant low murmur of teenage motion. Meriwether High was bigger than her last school. Taller ceilings, shinier banners. Home of the Mustangs, one read, strive, serve, succeed. The words meant nothing. Posters always lied. As she made her way to the front office, students moved past her like currents in a stream. None of them touched her. None of them spoke. And she was grateful for that. The receptionist didn't look up when she walked in, just pointed to a clipboard and said, "Sign in." Zariah scribbled her name with careful loops. The woman handed her a schedule, without smiling. Lockers in hallway 6B. Homerooms room 112. Orchestras in 104. That all? Zariah nodded once. The woman turned away. It was fine. She didn't want smiles. Smiles came with questions. As she moved through the hall toward her locker, she passed by clumps of laughter and eye rolls in open lockers full of personality. Stickers, Polaroids, lip glosses, football posters. Zariah's locker would stay blank. A container, nothing more. She found it at the far end of 6B. She didn't open it, just sat down on the floor beside it and rested the violin case across her knees. The bell rang. Her first 3 classes passed in a blur of introductions and syllabus handouts. Teachers asked students to say something fun about themselves. Zariah said nothing. She stared at the board, pretended to take notes, let the others fill the space. By the time the lunch bell rang, she had already collected 2 nicknames whispered behind open textbooks. Violin Girl, the quiet transfer. She didn't mind. They weren't cruel. Yet, whispered names didn't hurt as much as shouted ones. And she'd long learned that nicknames were like weather. You could either let them soak you or stay still until they passed. In the cafeteria, she found a corner near the vending machines and pulled out her book of sonatas. She didn't eat. She didn't look up. She just traced the notes on the page with her fingers, imagining how the strings would sound if she were alone in a warm room instead of this buzzing, fluorescent hive of awkward small talk and cafeteria pizza. She barely touched the food her mom had packed. Not because she wasn't hungry, but because eating meant taking off the cloak. And right now, she needed that silence like oxygen. 6th period came. Orchestra. Room 104. She hesitated before opening the door. She knew this was the only class where she couldn't fully hide, where people listened for a living, and where Mr. Fletcher, she'd heard, ran things like a ship captain, rigid, precise, unyielding. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Rosin, old sheet music, the faint woodsy tang of varnished instruments. It felt familiar, like the living room in her childhood apartment. like her dad's breath before performance, like the space she ran to when the world grew too loud. Inside, students milled about. Some tuned their violins. Others dragged cello spikes into the floor. A few chatted in cliques. Those are the ones with expensive cases, monogram bows, designer headbands that matched their chin rests. She kept her head down and walked toward the empty back row. No one said hello. No one noticed her. Except him, Mr. Roland Fletcher. Mid-50s. Thin wire-rimmed glasses. Beige blazer with elbows patched like he wanted people to think he read Hemingway in his spare time. His hair was slicked back like it had been trained to retreat, and his mouth was pressed into a permanent frown, like he didn't believe in smiling unless it was sarcastic. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses, then looked down at the roster. "Miles," he said flatly. She nodded. He didn't say welcome. He didn't ask what she played. He didn't smile. He just pointed with his baton. Back row. It wasn't suggestion. It wasn't neutral. It was placement. In the span of 2 seconds, she was categorized, cataloged, and consigned to the part of the room where sounds blended and solos never lived. Zariah sat down without protest. She gently placed her violin case across her lap, and she whispered to herself, so softly no one could hear, "It's fine. I don't need a solo. I just need to survive the room." And for now, that would be enough. Zariah didn't speak during that first orchestra class. She barely moved. Her violin case stayed cradled across her knees like a fragile artifact. The bell had rung, and Mr. Fletcher had begun his routine. Part drill sergeant, part conductor, part critic. He handed out sheet music with surgical precision, calling students by name, full names, before giving each of them roles in the ensemble. First chair, you take the solo. Lead second violins. He didn't say her name again. Not Zariah. Not even Miles. Just a baton tap on the stand to signal the beginning. Zariah kept her head low and followed along. She unpacked her violin slowly, lovingly. It was a little scratched, a little dull, but her fingers moved across the wood with the gentleness of memory. The scroll still smelled faintly of pine rosin, and the chin rests had been smoothed down by years of practice. She tuned her strings in silence, A, D, G, E, more by feel than by ear. The tension of the room was louder than the music. She adjusted her posture, set the bow against the strings, and waited. They began rehearsing a slow, structured arrangement, a reworking of Mozart's Divertimento in D major. It wasn't difficult. Not really. But Fletcher conducted it like it was a sacred ritual. And Zariah? She followed every note on the page. Perfectly. Without flair. Without flash. She played like she was whispering with a bow. No one noticed at first. But by the second run-through, someone did. From the cello section, a girl turned her head. Her name, Zariah later learned, was Lonnie Grant, Jr., first-chair cellist, and one of the few students in the room who didn't carry themselves like they'd been handed a music degree at birth. Lonnie noticed the way Zariah shifted positions mid-bar without pausing, the way her bow arm stayed fluid, even in crescendos, the way she never missed a dynamic mark, not even the subtle ones Fletcher had scrawled into margins. She didn't say anything, just glanced. Once, then again, then leaned slightly to whisper something to the girl beside her. Zariah saw it, even if she didn't react. She'd spent years watching people from behind. You learn how to read micro-expressions like sheet music. Tightened jaws, side glances, drop gazes. They all meant something. And those glances? They meant curiosity, which was dangerous. Because curiosity turned to attention. Attention turned to questions. And questions? They led to exposure. After class, she waited until most of the others had left before packing up. She wiped the strings with a cloth she kept folded in her hoodie pocket. Not because she was a perfectionist, but because her father had always told her, respect the instrument, and it'll carry your voice longer than your throat ever could. She tucked the violin into its case with practiced care and walked toward the door, eyes fixed on the scuffed tile beneath her feet. That's when she heard it. "Hey!" The voice was soft, uncertain, not mocking. She turned, slowly. It was Lonnie. She was standing with her cello slung over one shoulder, brows knit like she wasn't sure if she'd just broken some unspoken rule. "You played clean," Lonnie said, tucking her curls behind one ear. "Like, real clean. I didn't even hear you miss a shift." Zariah blinked. She wasn't sure how to respond. A compliment was always the start of something, admiration or challenge. Sometimes both. "I've been playing since I was 6, she said quietly. "Muscle memory." Lonnie smiled. Not condescending, not performative, just real. "Wish I had muscle memory like that." Zariah offered a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned and left. She didn't need new friends. Not yet, but something about that moment stayed with her the rest of the day. In the hallways, Zariah kept her head down as always, but something had shifted, subtle, but there. Some students passed by without looking, but a few looked twice. Some tried to figure out what her deal was. Was she quiet because she was shy? Because she was better than them? Because she had something to hide? They didn't know, and that made them curious, which, again, made her nervous. By the time she got home that afternoon, she was exhausted, not from classes, but from managing invisibility like a full-time job. Her mom greeted her with a warm, "Hey, baby," from the kitchen. The smell of collard greens filled the apartment, wrapping around Zariah like a soft quilt she hadn't asked for but needed. "School okay?" her mom asked without turning around. Zariah paused, considered lying, then said, "It was quiet." Her mom chuckled. "So, just the way you like it?" "Yeah," Zariah said, but she didn't sound sure, because for the first time in a while, she hadn't been entirely invisible. That night, Zariah lay in bed with a violin case beside her. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of plumbing in the walls. The city outside buzzed distantly. Sirens, buses, wind brushing against windows. She stared at the ceiling, remembering the glance from Lonnie, the way her bow moved like breath during rehearsal, the soft catch in Mr. Fletcher's brow when she landed a run of 16th notes flawlessly. Maybe it was okay, just once, to let someone hear her. Just a little. Just enough. But not too much, because she still had one rule. Be excellent, but never enough to draw fire. And in a room like 104, that line was razor thin. Mr. Fletcher never yelled. He didn't need to. His authority didn't live in volume. It lived in posture, in the stiff lines of his blazer, in the pointed silences that followed questions he didn't think were worth answering, in the way he tapped the baton against a music stand, not loud but sharp, like a scalpel finding something to cut. To most students, Fletcher was strict. To some, he was brilliant. To a few, he was unbearable. But to Zariah, Fletcher was dangerous, not because he screamed, but because he made assumptions feel like facts. It began with small things. He never asked where she studied before coming to Meriwether. He never asked what she'd learned, what pieces she performed, who her instructors were. With other students, he inquired about private tutors and summer programs. He name-dropped conservatories, Juilliard, Interlaken, Eastman. But when it came to Zariah, he didn't ask. He assumed. Assumed her technique was accidental. Assumed her silence meant a lack of depth. Assumed her violin case, taped up and worn, meant she didn't belong in the same room as the kids with carbon fiber bows and monogram cases. She saw it in the way he looked at her, not with curiosity, but calculation, like she was a question on a test he'd already graded as wrong. In the second week of class, Fletcher started assigning duets. He paired students together, usually matching skill levels, sometimes for balance, occasionally for challenge. When he got to Zariah, he paused. The room stilled. It wasn't dramatic, just tense. He tapped the roster with his baton, eyes scanning like he was considering options, then said, "Miles, you'll partner with Bennett." A few students glanced at each other. Bennett Wallace was a sophomore. He wasn't bad, but he was inconsistent. Rushed rhythms, shaky intonation, a tendency to overcompensate with volume when unsure. Fletcher knew this. Everyone did. Pairing them wasn't balanced. It was deliberate. Zariah knew what it meant. So did Lonnie. When rehearsal began, Zariah played her part with precision, blending smoothly, adjusting her bowing just enough to keep Ben afloat without covering for him. She never flinched, never frowned. Her sound adapted like water around a jagged rock. Fletcher didn't praise it. He stopped him halfway through and said, "Again, Miles, lighten your tone. You're overpowering him." She blinked. She wasn't. Lonnie's eyebrows lifted slightly across the room. They tried again. This time, Zariah barely moved her bow, letting Bennett take the lead. It fell apart in bar 23. Fletcher sighed. "No coordination," he said, scribbling something on his score. "We'll revisit this." He didn't say who was at fault, but everyone knew who he meant. By Friday, the pattern was clear. Fletcher corrected Zariah for things she hadn't done, ignored things she had. When she nailed a difficult passage during sectionals, he simply nodded without a word. But when another student, Marcus, a third-chair violinist, played the same section with minor hesitations, Fletcher clapped and said, "Now that's phrasing." Zariah didn't react. She never did, because reacting gave people something to push against. That afternoon, as students packed up, Lonnie walked by Zariah's seat and paused. "Did you really just get blamed for Bennett's tempo issues?" she asked, not bothering to lower her voice. Zariah didn't answer. "You know what he's doing, right?" Zariah zipped her case shut and stood. "I know." Lonnie tilted her head. "So why not say something?" Zariah looked her in the eye. "Because he wants me to." Zariah had seen it before. Teachers like Fletcher didn't need slurs or raised voices. Their power came through the slow erosion of your certainty. One miscredit, one bad pairing, one public correction in front of peers. Drip by drip, they made you question your place in the room. Then your right to be in it. And finally, whether the sound coming from your strings was even yours at all. That night, Zariah sat at the window of her apartment, violin across her lap. She wasn't playing, just holding it, feeling the weight of it, remembering what her father used to say when he watched her practice. "Don't play like you're trying to prove something. Play like you already did." She used to think that was confidence. Now she realized it was survival. Back at school the next Monday, Fletcher rearranged the seating chart. No warning. He posted it on the whiteboard before class. First and second chairs were unchanged. So were the cellists. The violas were shuffled slightly. But in the second violin section, Zariah's name had been moved to the far back corner. Last row, outer edge. Lonnie saw it before Zariah did. She looked at the board, then at Zariah, then at Fletcher. Zariah didn't say a word. She just walked to her new seat. From the back of the room, the orchestra sounded different, more distant, more detached. But Zariah didn't mind, because from here, she could see everything. Every expression, every flick of Fletcher's baton, every glance when someone messed up, every micro-reaction when she played perfectly and he chose to look away. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was under surveillance. And she was documenting everything, with every clean shift, with every smooth glissando, with every note that refused to be mediocre. Because if he was going to conduct her story through prejudice, she was going to rewrite it with a bow, and he was going to have to listen, whether he liked it or not. It was Thursday, gray sky, drizzling cold, the kind of day that felt damp even on your bones. Zariah walked into room 104 exactly 1 minute before the bell rang. On the surface, nothing had changed. The lights buzzed faintly above. Students joked quietly as they tuned their instruments. Lonnie gave her a small nod from the cello section. Fletcher stood at the front of the room, lips tight, baton in hand, flipping through sheet music like he was irritated with the air itself. Zariah took her usual seat, the far back, the edge, the corner of the orchestra, where even sound felt optional. She had learned, over the past few weeks, how to disappear in plain sight. But that morning, Mr. Fletcher had come to class with an agenda. You could tell by the way he walked in, too quiet, too composed. The kind of calm that came before a snap. He didn't begin with tuning. He didn't hand out new scores. He simply stood in front of the orchestra, looking over the class like a chessboard he was getting bored of. Then, without preamble, he tapped the music stand with his baton 3 times. Sharp, intentional. The room hushed. "Miles," he said, voice flat. It wasn't a question. Zariah looked up, heart already climbing into her throat. Fletcher gestured toward the open space in front of the whiteboard. "Why don't you come up and show us what you've got?" No one breathed. Lonnie sat up straighter in her chair. A few second violins shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the cello row whispered, "Wait, what?" Zariah didn't move. Fletcher arched a brow. "You've been here a few weeks now," he continued, his tone cool and even. "We've all heard you blend, heard you follow. Let's see what you can do when you lead." There it was. Not an invitation. A performance. A setup. A test. Zariah's palms were damp against the wood of her violin case. Her mouth dry. She hated being watched. Hated being made a spectacle. Especially when a request came wrapped in sarcasm and coated in power. This wasn't admiration. This was an ambush. Still, she stood. Slowly. Deliberately. She walked the long aisle to the front of the room, every step echoing like footsteps down a tunnel. Her violin case felt heavier than usual, like it knew what this was. She could feel Fletcher's eyes on her. Cold, measuring, already preparing to dismiss whatever came next. When she reached the front, she didn't speak. Didn't ask what to play. Didn't need to. She opened the case, took out her violin, tightened her bow, tuned silently. All of it muscle memory now. Second nature. Fletcher tilted his head slightly, arms crossed. "We're all ears," he said dryly. "Whenever you're ready." A few soft snickers rippled behind her. Zariah heard them. Everyone. But she didn't flinch. She stood still for a beat longer than expected. And then, without sheet music, without a cue, she placed her bow on the string. And began. She chose Dvořák. Not because it was flashy. Not because it was easy. But because it was honest. A slow, yearning line from one of his lesser-known chamber works. Minor key. Heavy tone. The kind of melody that lived in your ribs. The first note was breathy, soft, almost uncertain. But the second was stronger. The third, certain. Within seconds, the room fell completely silent. No one moved. Because Zariah wasn't performing. She was translating. Her fingers glided across the fingerboard with quiet control. Her bow arm painting arcs of longing in the air. Each phrase bled into the next, not with drama, but with depth. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. It was surgical. Delicate, mournful, and exact. She didn't rush. Didn't slow down to milk the moment. She played the truth of the music. And somehow, the truth of herself. And when she reached the final note, she let it hang. Not fade. Hang. Like a word left unsaid on purpose. And then she lowered her bow. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was reverent. The kind of silence that didn't ask for applause. The kind that held a room hostage. Zariah turned to walk back to her seat. But just before she took that first step, Fletcher spoke. "Well," he said, voice sharp enough to cut thread. That was the surprise. A few chuckles flickered in the back. Zariah froze. Fletcher smiled, tight-lipped. "You've got a unique tone. Not textbook, but expressive. Definitely not what I expected from someone with." He paused, just long enough to let the implication land. "Your background." The room went still again. Not in all this time. In discomfort. Even the students who usually laughed at his dry wit didn't laugh this time. Lonnie looked like she was ready to speak, but stopped herself. Zariah blinked slowly, her face unreadable. She turned, walked back to her seat, sat down, didn't speak, didn't react. But inside, her silence burned. Not from shame, not from defeat, from clarity. Because now she knew. It didn't matter how perfectly she played. Fletcher had already written her into a category, and no melody could erase ink that thick. But what Fletcher didn't understand was that Zariah wasn't trying to erase anything. She was writing over it, note by note, bar by bar, because he had called her out to be mocked. But instead, the whole room had heard something else. And so had he. The next day, Zariah walked into room 104 differently. Not louder, not prouder, but straighter. Like something inside her had quietly locked into place overnight. Like a dial had turned and clicked. She still took her usual seat in the back row. Still unpacked her violin with quiet care. Still avoided eye contact with Mr. Fletcher, who, as usual, didn't greet her or acknowledge her presence. But the room noticed. Something had changed. People shifted when she passed. Looked longer. Leaned in not out of malice, but because now they were curious. And in a room full of rehearsed perfection, curiosity was currency. Fletcher didn't bring up her solo from the day before. He didn't comment, didn't critique, didn't even glance in her direction. But he felt it. You could see in the way he gripped his baton tighter than usual, the way his jaw set mid-rehearsal, the way his corrections to other students were sharper, more clipped. He was on edge, and Zariah knew why. Because for the first time, he wasn't in full control of the room. Midway through class, Fletcher tapped his stand. "Let's shift focus," he announced. "We'll run solo warm-ups. Quick excerpts. Cold, no sheet music." A groan ran through the room, like wind through leaves. "You'll play 8 bars," he continued. Something familiar. Something that shows tone and agility. Zariah didn't flinch, but her grip tightened around her bow. She knew what this was. A retaliation. Fletcher wasn't finished testing her. Yesterday had slipped through his fingers. Today, he'd get the reaction he wanted. A stumble. A crack. Something that reminded the room where power still lived. "Let's start from the back today," Fletcher said casually. The entire class turned. "Back row." Zariah. "Of course." She rose slowly. There was no question. No protest. No hesitation. Just a quiet compliance. One that looked like submission, but felt more like strategy. She walked to the front of the room again. The same worn steps. The same stage. But this time, something was different. She wasn't walking into a trap. She was walking into a spotlight she chose to stand in. Zariah positioned herself. No music stand. No cue. Just her, the violin, and the moment. She took one breath, then another, and she began. This time, she chose Kreisler's Preludium and Allegro, not the slow part, not the gentle intro. The Allegro, the fire, the part that sounded like a storm trying to rip through a concert hall. Frenzied but precise, furious but structured. A piece that required confidence, control, and a level of command most musicians spent years trying to earn. And she nailed it. Her fingers moved like lightning, blistering up the fingerboard, then falling back in perfect cascades. Her bow exploded across the strings, cutting sharp, clean lines through the air. Every shift was intentional. Every crescendo landed. Every rest, silent but thick with energy. It was not quiet. It was calculated chaos. And it was brilliant. The room was stunned. Halfway through, students stopped pretending to shuffle sheet music or fix bows. Even Fletcher, stone-faced Fletcher, was still. Arms crossed, mouth tight, eyes frozen, because she wasn't performing anymore. She was commanding, taking back every inch of space he'd tried to shrink her into. She ended on a clean, crisp cadence, one last cut through the silence, and then lowered her bow. No one clapped, but no one moved either. Even the light seemed quieter. Zariah didn't look at Fletcher. She didn't need to. She turned, walked back to her seat, sat down like it was any other day. But everyone in the room knew it wasn't. Fletcher finally spoke. His voice was tight. Too casual. "Impressive," he said. "For someone who doesn't exactly look like the conservatory type." The words sliced the air. This time, no one laughed. Not even the students who usually did. Lonnie looked like she might break her bow in half. A boy near the front dropped his gaze to the floor. Zariah stared straight ahead. No reaction. No reply. Just silence. The kind that filled a room like thunder without sound. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Next," he barked. "Jonah, you're up." But Jonah didn't move. He was still staring at Zariah. His hands were shaking. Because how do you follow that? The rest of the class passed like a dream underwater. Zariah didn't remember the rest of the solos. Didn't remember what piece they practiced next. Didn't hear Fletcher's corrections or the other students' chatter. She was still inside the performance. Not just what she'd played, but what it meant. After class, she packed up quickly. No lingering. No eye contact. But just as she reached the door, Lonnie caught up to her. "Girl," she whispered. He looked like he swallowed a lemon. Zariah almost laughed. Almost. But her face remained steady. Because while the room had felt stunned, she had felt free. That night, back in her bedroom, Zariah placed a violin on her lap and ran her fingers gently along the strings. Not to play, just to feel them. The resonance still hummed inside her, not from nerves, but from release. Because yesterday, she was called out to be silenced. But today, she had spoken, and the room had listened. Mr. Fletcher didn't say a word the next morning. Not to class, not to Zariah, not to anyone. He entered room 1045 minutes before the bell, laid his baton neatly on the conductor's stand, and spent the next few minutes arranging sheet music like he was trying to solve a puzzle that refused to be solved. The rest of the room moved around him with a strange tension. Students unpacked their instruments, tuned softly, exchanged glances. A few whispered about the previous day, about Zariah's playing, about the way Fletcher had stumbled over his own authority in front of everyone. He didn't call on her. He didn't move her seat. But that silence, it was louder than any command. Zariah, as always, sat in the back row, but she wasn't hiding anymore. There was a quiet defiance in her posture now, her shoulders squared, her hands steady, the bow on her stand ready, not tucked away like an afterthought, but waiting like it belonged exactly where it was. And Fletcher? He noticed. Every time his eyes scanned the room, they lingered on her a moment too long. Every time she shifted her fingers with perfect grace during rehearsal, he flinched just a bit, because now he couldn't pretend. He had seen it. And once you've seen a flame, you can't go back to calling it smoke. By the second piece of the day, a lyrical chamber reduction of Mendelssohn, Fletcher called for individual section leads to run warm-ups. He skipped Zariah. She should have expected it. Instead, he called on Marcus, his safe choice, the polished second chair with perfect diction, and a family name already etched into the school's donation plaques. Marcus stood and played a 2-minute excerpt. It was good, technically clean, textbook phrasing. Everything a judge would smile politely at, but it lacked something. Wait, so, presence. When he finished, the class offered polite nods. But no one looked stunned. No one leaned forward. And Fletcher praised it anyway. Excellent control. Beautiful bowing. Exactly what I'm looking for. He glanced towards Zariah without turning his head. The message was clear. That is what belongs here. After class, Zariah lingered again. Not because she wanted to confront anyone, but because she was listening. To the way the room emptied. To the way silence filled it when she was the only one left. Fletcher was at his desk, organizing files into color-coded folders, green for performance reviews, blue for solo auditions, red for disciplinary records. He didn't look up, but his voice came out dry like chalk dust. "You play well." Zariah froze. It was the first time he'd said anything to her directly since the solo. She turned slowly. Fletcher still wasn't looking at her. "You play well," he repeated, "but you don't blend." Zariah tilted her head. "I wasn't trying to blend." Fletcher finally looked at her then. Eyes narrowed, jaw tight. "This isn't a stage, Miles. It's an ensemble." The words weren't correction. They were warning. But Zariah didn't blink. She stepped forward just slightly and said, voice steady, "I know the difference." Fletcher's brow twitched, just for a second. Then he closed a red folder in front of him and stacked it atop the others like he was sealing something away. "Class dismissed," he muttered. But she was already walking out. That afternoon, the hallway chatter had shifted. Zariah heard it near the vending machines in the stairwell, even between the lockers during fourth period. "Did you hear her play Kreisler? I didn't even know she had that in her." Fletcher didn't even know what to say. She didn't just play. She owned the room. Zariah said nothing. She kept walking, head high, headphones on, though there was no music playing. She just liked the barrier. But inside, something stirred. It wasn't pride. Not exactly. It was clarity. She had spent weeks trying not to be seen, trying not to be called out, trying not to become the story. And now, she was the story, whether she wanted to be or not. That night, Zariah practiced alone in the apartment. She didn't run scales. She didn't touch her audition repertoire. She simply closed her eyes and let the bow glide where it wanted. Minor thirds, broken arpeggios, whispered harmonics. She wasn't playing for technique. She was playing for release. Her mom passed by the open bedroom door and paused. "You sound different," she said softly. Zariah didn't open her eyes. "Different how?" Her mom smiled faintly, like, "You're not asking permission anymore." At school the next day, Fletcher introduced a new solo rotation schedule. Zariah's name wasn't on it. He had picked the same names as always. Marcus, Chloe, Rachel, the safe trio. When Lonnie saw the list, she muttered under her breath, "You've got to be kidding me." Zariah just shrugged. "It's fine," she said. "I don't need a slot." But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't being excluded because she lacked talent. She was being excluded because she had too much. Because when someone like Fletcher built his world on control and hierarchy, someone like Zariah was a disruption, a variable he didn't plan for. And no matter how many rotations he skipped her in, he could no longer unsee her. Not in that room, not in that chair, not in that silence she shattered with every note. There's a kind of rebellion that doesn't make noise. It doesn't yell, doesn't slam doors, doesn't throw punches. It just stands its ground, quietly, unapologetically, unmoving. That's what Zariah Miles had become. Not a firebrand, not a protest, but a presence. And in room 104, presence had power. The cold solo rotation resumed on a gray Wednesday morning. The air in the music room had a bite to it. Stiff, electric. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was tension. Either way, it settled over the students like a second layer of skin. Fletcher stood at the front, flipping his conductor's baton between two fingers. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't need to. He was already in motion, already rewriting the rules to remind everyone who was in charge. "We're continuing solo rounds today," he said, tone dry as chalk. "Cold starts. 8 bars. Memory only." The class groaned. "Start with the back," he added. "The back row. Zariah's row." Again, Lonnie raised an eyebrow from the cello section, exchanging a look with Brielle in the front chairs. Even students who remained neutral for weeks shifted in their seats. They weren't dumb. They saw what this was. Zariah stood slowly, no surprise in her eyes. Her violin was already tuned, her bow already rosined. Her body moved with the same quiet rhythm it always had, measured, precise. She walked to the front of the room, past students who now watched her with something more than curiosity. They watched like they were waiting for someone to show them what resistance looked like without a fist. She didn't speak, didn't ask permission. She raised the violin to her chin, closed her eyes for a second and began. Kreisler was for power. Dvořák was for grief. But today, she chose Bach, the presto from Sonata No. 1 in G minor. Fast, technical, relentless. It was a cascade of 16th notes, each one like a breath barely caught before the next came crashing through. But Zariah didn't stumble. She didn't even pause. Her fingers moved like they were born for this, like they remembered every lesson her father had whispered through cracked practice books, like her hands still carried the ghosts of every street performance he gave on the corner of Peachtree and Auburn. This wasn't just a solo. It was surgical defiance. Fletcher watched from the conductor's stand. His arms were crossed, his eyes sharp, but behind that calm was something else. Tension, terror, recognition. She was proving something he couldn't challenge, because it wasn't loud and it wasn't emotional. It was exact. And that's what made it dangerous. When she finished, Zariah didn't wait for acknowledgement. She simply lowered a bow, turned, and walked back to her seat. There was no applause, but there wasn't mockery either. Just that familiar silence, the one that followed all her solos now, the kind that made it impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Thank you, Miles," he said, voice clipped. "Let's continue. Chloe, you're next." But Chloe didn't move. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened her case. The rest of class passed in quiet echoes. Each student played their assigned piece. Some fumbled, some excelled, but none of it matched the intensity that Zariah had left lingering in the room. Fletcher tried to regain control. He adjusted tempos, criticized phrasing, handed out redundant bowing notes. But the shift had already happened. The power wasn't in his hands anymore. It was in the pause, the silence between Zariah's notes. The realization that the girl he had tried to erase, had tried to sideline, was no longer someone he could ignore. After class, Fletcher pulled her aside. Zariah paused at the doorway, one hand still on her case. "Miles," he said, "stay a moment." The room emptied slowly. Some students lingered by the door, pretending to tie their shoes or check their phones. No one wanted to miss whatever was about to happen. Zariah turned to face him. He didn't sit. He just stood there, staring. "You play forcefully," he said. Zariah said nothing. "It's technically sound, yes, but not always appropriate for this ensemble." There it was, the veiled critique, the attempt to reframe her excellence as arrogance, her boldness as ego, her individuality as disruption. Zariah looked him in the eye. "You asked for a solo," she said. "I played one." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Sometimes less is more, Miles." Zariah's voice stayed level. "Sometimes more is exactly what's needed." She walked out before he could reply. And this time, she didn't feel like a student leaving a classroom. She felt like a storm exiting the room, quiet, but still shaking the walls behind her. That evening, Zariah practiced in her bedroom, but not scales, not concert pieces. She improvised, let the strings speak for her, let the pressure slide off her shoulders and into the bow, let the silence of the apartment become her stage. Her mother walked past and paused in the doorway. Zariah looked up mid-measure. Her mom didn't say anything, just smiled and said, "You're playing like you're not afraid anymore." Zariah exhaled slowly. "I'm not," because resistance doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers through 16th notes, speaks in cadences, declares war in minor keys. And Zariah, she had declared something, without raising her voice once. By Thursday, the hallway whispers had grown roots. Zariah could feel in the way students stepped aside when she walked through the corridors. Not out of fear, but out of something more complex. Reverence, maybe, or discomfort. She wasn't sure. All she knew was that her name had stopped being said like a mystery. Now it was a reference point. That's the girl from orchestra. She played Kreisler from memory. I heard she shut Fletcher down with just a violin. Zariah didn't correct any of them. Didn't confirm. Didn't deny. Because whatever they thought they saw, the truth was still hers. Room 104 had become a pressure chamber. Fletcher's baton snapped sharper now, his instructions more exact. He called on students with clipped tones and handed out new sheet music with a kind of frustration disguised as precision. But he never said Zariah's name. He didn't need to. Every time he skipped over her for solos. Every time he glanced past her when assigning parts. Every time he praised someone else for something she had done better 2 days before. It was all a form of control, selective silence. And yet, somehow, the more he tried to push her into the background, the more the room noticed her. That afternoon, Fletcher introduced a new rehearsal piece, an intricate orchestral reduction of Bartók's Romanian folk dances. It was rhythmic, unpredictable, and technically demanding, especially for the violins. He passed out the sheets like a warning, announcing that next week's rehearsals would include sectional challenges for placement in the spring showcase. "You'll be evaluated individually," he said. "Play like it matters." It was a subtle jab. Everyone heard it. Zariah didn't react. She took the music without a word and scanned the opening tempo markings. Triple meter, sudden accelerandos, bowing complexity embedded in what looked deceptively simple. She liked it because Bartók wasn't pretty. He was raw, honest, angular, and honesty was something she could work with after rehearsal. As students filtered out in pairs and trios, Fletcher approached her desk. Zariah was still packing her violin. She didn't look up. "Interesting phrasing today," he said. "In the third movement, you played through the rallentando." Zariah paused. "I adjusted for tempo," she replied quietly. "The metronome Fletcher gave us was off by 3 beats." He tilted his head slightly. "So you changed the score?" She looked up now, meeting his gaze. "I interpreted it." A beat passed. Then Fletcher smiled. But it wasn't warm. It was surgical. "You play well," he said. "I mean that. Truly. For someone who doesn't exactly look like the conservatory type." The words hit the room like a string snapping mid-performance. Not loud, but unmistakable. Zariah blinked. She wasn't surprised. Not really. But that didn't make it easier to hear. She stared at him, her case halfway zipped, her hands frozen. And for the first time in a long time, she wanted to scream. Not just for herself, but for every student who'd ever been told that their presence was the problem, that their talent was a fluke, that their identity disqualified them from excellence. But she didn't scream. She didn't even speak. She finished zipping her case, stood up, slid the strap over her shoulder. Then, as calmly as if she were stating the weather, she said, "It's a good thing talent doesn't have a look then." Fletcher's face tightened. But Zariah was already walking out. Outside room 104, the hallway buzzed with low afternoon chatter. Lockers slammed. Laughter ricocheted off tile. Somewhere down the corridor, a PA system beeped to announce a tardy warning. Zariah leaned against the cool metal of her locker and let herself breathe. One deep inhale. Hold. Slow exhale. Lonnie found her a minute later. Cello strapped her back. Face unreadable. "I heard what he said." Lonnie murmured. Zariah didn't respond. Lonnie leaned in slightly. That wasn't a compliment. Zariah smiled, barely. It had teeth. He's scared. Zariah raised an eyebrow. Of me? Of not being the smartest one in the room anymore. They both stood there for a second, letting that truth hang. Later that night, Zariah sat in her room, her violin propped against her leg, the new Bartók piece spread across the bed like a map. She didn't play it yet. She just stared at the notes. So jagged, so syncopated, so unapologetically messy. It was beautiful because it didn't try to be elegant. It just told the truth through friction and tension and rhythm that didn't ask permission. Kind of like her. Her mom passed by the door, pausing. "That piece hard." Zariah looked up. "It's honest." Her mom nodded, stepped into the room. "That teacher still bothering you?" Zariah hesitated. Then, "He gave me a compliment today." Her mom raised an eyebrow. "One of those backhanded ones?" Zariah nodded. "The kind that makes you want to burn the whole music stand." Her mom laughed. "Don't burn anything. Just keep playing." Zariah looked at the sheet music again. "Yeah," she said softly. "But this time, I'm playing like the stand's already on fire. Because sometimes resistance doesn't come with shouting. Sometimes it walks in front of the room when called, plays flawlessly, gets insulted for doing it, and keeps showing up anyway." It showed up in her locker on a Friday, folded into quarters. No envelope, no name, just paper. At first, Zariah thought it was trash. Another flyer for a bake sale, or a chess club, or one of those student council meetings where no one really talked unless they were trying to look smart. She picked it up out of habit, intending to toss it, but then her eyes caught 4 words in bold at the top. "We're looking for musicians." She unfolded it slowly. It wasn't glossy, wasn't flashy, just plain white with simple black font, and a logo she didn't recognize. Stone Mount Youth Ensemble. Below the headline, it read, "Auditions open. We're not looking for perfect. We're looking for musicians who have something to say." That line stopped her. She read it again, and again, like a whisper that had been waiting years to speak. Because this wasn't about ranking chairs, or nailing dynamics, or getting a grade. It was about being heard. Zariah tucked the flyer into her sketchbook and closed the locker gently. She didn't tell anyone, not even Lonnie. Not yet, because hope, real hope, was fragile at first. And this felt different than anything room 104 had ever offered. That afternoon, she sat across from Ms. Reyes, the school guidance counselor, pretending to ask about college credit requirements for the spring. Really, she wanted to ask about the flyer, about whether it was real, whether people like her actually got in, whether it was worth trying. But she couldn't quite form the question. Ms. Reyes, to her credit, noticed. "You okay, Zariah?" Zariah hesitated, then slid the flyer across the desk. "Do you know anything about this?" Reyes picked it up, scanned it, then smiled. "The youth ensemble? Yeah, I know them. Non-profit group. Runs weekend music programs downtown. Mostly for students who don't have private instruction or access to big-name conservatories." Zariah looked down. "So it's legit?" Reyes tilted her head. "You're not asking if it's legit. You're asking if they'll take you seriously." Zariah swallowed hard. Didn't answer. Reyes leaned forward. "Let me tell you something, Z. They don't care what school you go to, or who your teacher is, or if your violin case looks like it's been through a war zone." She smiled. "They care what you sound like when no one's watching." Zariah didn't go home right away that evening. Instead, she took the long way, walked 3 blocks past her usual bus stop, past the corner store, past the pharmacy, until she found herself standing outside a small, square building with a weathered blue awning. Stone Mountain Community Art Center. The windows were fogged from the inside, and the paint on the door was peeling at the edges. But through the glass, she could see movement. Kids with violins and flutes, a woman adjusting music stands, someone laughing. No judgment, no ranks, just music. Zariah stood there for a long minute, watching, then turned and walked home, her heart beating different. That night, she told her mom. Not the whole story. Not about Fletcher. Not about the showcase. Just the part about the flyer. Her mom listened, quietly cutting onions in the kitchen, her back to the stove. "You want to do it?" she asked. Zariah nodded. "I think so." "You scared?" Zariah hesitated. "A little." Her mom smiled. "That's usually how you know it's worth it." The next day, Zariah pulled out her audition piece. She didn't pick something safe. She didn't pick Dvořák or Kreisler or even Bach. She chose Florence Price, a composer whose music had been silenced for years, buried under the weight of being too black, too female, too emotional. A composer who'd had a fight just to be shelved next to names like Beethoven and Brahms. Zariah practiced a slow movement, every note like breath through scar tissue, every phrase like a confession she hadn't known how to speak. She didn't aim for perfection. She aimed for truth, and that made all the difference. On Sunday morning, she woke up before the sun, braided her hair into tight rows, polished her shoes, tuned her violin 3 times before leaving the apartment. Her mom hugged her at the door. "Don't play like you need them," she whispered. "Play like you already know." The community center was warm when she arrived. The kind of warm that came from old radiators and fresh coffee and people who cared. The lobby was buzzing with quiet conversation. Parents reading magazines. Kids scrolling on phones. Volunteers with clipboards and gentle voices. Zariah checked in and was handed a numbered sticker. Warm-up rooms down the hall. A woman said kindly, "You're on in 15. Zariah nodded, then headed down the hallway lined with hand-painted posters and photos of past concerts. She found a corner in the warm-up room, unpacked her violin, and sat. She didn't run scales. She didn't rehearse the toughest measures. She closed her eyes and just breathed. Let the room fall away. Let the nerves settle. Let her bow rest gently against the string. And waited for her number to be called. When it was, she stepped into the audition room alone. 3 judges. 1 piano. No fanfare. She nodded politely. introduced the piece, then lifted her violin and began. She didn't play perfectly. She missed a shift halfway through. One note slid sharp. Another was a beat too slow. But she didn't stop. She let the music live, let it stumble, recover, breathe, and when she finished, she lowered the violin and looked up. None of the judges clapped, but one of them smiled. That was real, she said, and Zariah knew that was enough. The moment Zariah stepped outside the audition room, the noise of the world returned. Distant chatter in the hallway, someone laughing, a piano riff bleeding faintly from another classroom, the scrape of violin cases on linoleum. Familiar sounds, but they felt distant, muted beneath the hum of what had just happened. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood there for a moment, violin in hand, her fingers still curved from the last note she played. The Florence Price piece still echoed inside her, like a bell rung softly, and left to ring out in silence. A woman at the registration table looked up. "You finished?" Zariah nodded. "They said I could go?" The woman smiled. "Then you're free to go." Free. Zariah let that word sit in her chest as she walked toward the exit. Not done. Not finished. Free. She didn't check for a results email that night. She didn't tell her mom how it went. Not at first. They just ate dinner in silence. Chicken with rice and steamed broccoli, while the TV mumbled in the background. Her mom didn't push, just refilled her water glass and gently said, "You look lighter," and Zariah realized she was. Not because she had won anything, but because for once she had played without permission or pressure. She'd walked into a room not built for her, filled it with her sound, and left knowing, win or lose, that her voice had reached someone. Monday morning at Meriwether High was aggressively normal. Fluorescent lights, slamming lockers, the smell of cheap floor polish, and teenage anxiety. No one knew about her audition. No one asked. They were too busy buzzing about prom themes, cafeteria pizza, and Coach Breyer's meltdown in gym last Friday. Room 104 was no different. Mr. Fletcher stood at the front, tapping his baton like usual, correcting finger with the same clinical annoyance, praising his favorites with robotic enthusiasm. Zariah walked in just before the bell, slid into her usual seat in the back, and unpacked her violin with slow, deliberate movements. She didn't expect anything different. She didn't want anything different. She just wanted to play. Fletcher passed out new sheet music. Mozart this time. Something deceptively joyful but rigid, like forced laughter. He called out sections, measured dynamics, conducted like a man rebuilding a wall that had cracked without warning. Zariah played cleanly, flawlessly even, but she played quietly. Not in volume, but in presence. She didn't push, didn't draw eyes, didn't correct anyone when they slipped half a measure behind. Because for the first time since arriving at the school, Zariah wasn't playing to prove anything. She'd already done that. Now, she was just listening to the room. And the room, it felt emptier than it used to. During break, Brielle slid into the chair beside her, plopping a granola bar on the music stand. "You okay?" Zariah raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. Why?" Brielle shrugged. "You're calm. It's making me nervous." Zariah smirked. "I'm always calm. Not like this." Brielle leaned in. "What happened this weekend?" Zariah hesitated. Then, softly, "I played somewhere else. For someone else." Brielle's eyes lit up. "Did you get in?" Zariah shook her head. "Don't know yet. Doesn't matter." That stopped Brielle. "Wait, what do you mean it doesn't matter?" Zariah paused, staring at the violin in her lap. "I didn't play for them. I didn't play for approval or a slot on a roster. I just played." "So you played for yourself?" Zariah looked up, thoughtful. "Not even that. I think I played for the girl I used to be, the one who thought she had to earn her voice." Brielle let out a low whistle. "Damn, that's poetic." Zariah smiled. "I guess Florence Price brings it out of people." After school, Ms. Reyes was waiting by the library doors. She wasn't holding a folder. She wasn't checking a list. She was just standing there, arms crossed lightly, like someone with something small but important to say. Zariah slowed as she approached. "You hear anything?" she asked. Reyes nodded. "The director of the youth ensemble called this morning. Said your audition was one of the most emotionally honest they've ever received." Zariah blinked. "Wait, really?" Reyes grinned. "You're in Z." Zariah didn't speak, didn't jump, didn't cheer, but something in her shoulders dropped. The tension of being almost enough finally loosened its grip. "They said you didn't just perform," Reyes continued. "You reminded them why they started the program in the first place." Zariah swallowed hard, and for a split second, her eyes burned, but she blinked it back. "I didn't think it would matter to anyone." Reyes tilted her head. "You didn't just play notes, kid. You spoke." That night, Zariah didn't practice. She didn't even touch her violin. She lit a candle by her windowsill, opened her sketchbook, and tucked the flyer next to the first anonymous note she'd gotten in school. Then she wrote a single sentence underneath them. "I didn't play for applause. I played to remember I exist." The next morning, she walked into room 104 just like always. Same backpack, same hoodie, same quiet steps. But she wasn't the same, because Fletcher could ignore her name on a solo list, could sideline her in rehearsals, could pretend she was background noise. But he couldn't take back what she already knew, that her sound mattered, that her story had weight, that her silence had never been empty, it had been waiting. April 22nd arrived with a nervous kind of sunlight, the kind that slips through half-closed blinds, soft and uncertain. It was the kind of morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. Zariah woke before her alarm. She didn't need a reminder. Her body already knew. Today was a showcase. Not the school showcase. Not Fletcher's. This one belonged to someone else. To her. She dressed with the same precision she used to tune her violin. Slowly, deliberately. No glitter. No stage makeup. Just a simple black dress, worn ballet flats, and her hair braided back so nothing would get in her way. She didn't tell anyone what piece she'd chosen. Not her mom. Not Ms. Reyes. Not even Brielle. Because this time, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about saying something she hadn't had words for. Not in all those months at Meriwether. Not in the back row of room 104. Not when Fletcher tried to reduce her to a moment. This was her music. Her moment. The Stone Mount Civic Center wasn't grand. It had 300 seats, faded red velvet curtains, and floors that creaked when people shifted in their chairs. But the room buzzed with warmth. Parents holding phones like shields, siblings bouncing in laps, volunteers passing out programs printed in grayscale with crooked staples. On the final page, Zariah's name was listed. Closing performance, Zariah Miles violin solo. No mention of the school. No mention of Fletcher. No introduction filled with credentials or awards. Just her name. And silence. Waiting. Backstage. She sat on a folding chair, violin case open at her feet. Her fingers rested on her lap, steady but electric. Her bow was already rosined, her strings already tuned, but her heart kept a quiet rhythm. She wasn't afraid. She was full. A soft knock tapped at the frame of the dressing room door. It was Helena Maddox, the director of a youth ensemble. Early 50s, silver streaks in her coiled hair, eyes that saw more than they said. She stepped in slowly, clipboard in hand. "They're ready for you," she said softly. Zariah stood. Maddox paused, then added, just above a whisper, "Whatever you do out there, make it yours." Zariah nodded once, then walked out into the lights. The stage wasn't extravagant, just a spotlight, a single mic for the MC, and a wooden floor that carried every step like a question. She didn't bow, didn't wave, didn't introduce herself. She walked to center stage, placed her sheet music on the stand, not to read it, but to honor it, and raise her violin to her chin. She didn't wait for silence. She commanded it, with breath, with poise, with one small gesture of her bow resting against the string. And then she played. Shostakovich, Violin Concerto No. 1, in a minor. It wasn't a crowd pleaser. It wasn't showy. It wasn't safe. But it was true. The opening notes were low and brooding, drawn slowly like a story being pulled from deep underground. Each phrase swelled like a breath trying not to become a sob. Each passage tightened like a throat before a scream. This wasn't performance. It was memory, confession, testimony. She thought of room 104, of Fletcher's sarcasm, of the first time he said back row. She thought of the moment he called to the front, not to celebrate her, but to laugh at her. She thought of every time he spoke her name like it was a warning or not at all, and she poured all of it into the strings. Every crack, every cut, every silence she'd ever swallowed just to make it through rehearsal. Her bow danced with grief and defiance. Her fingers shifted with a precision born not from privilege, but from pain, from late nights practicing in a bedroom too small for dreams, from a father who taught her how to speak through sound when the world tried to talk over her. The final passage built like a storm, sharp, tight, almost violent in its clarity. And then, just like that, it ended, not with a bang, but with a breath. The kind of silence that comes only when people forget how to clap. She lowered her violin slowly, didn't bow, didn't wait. She simply turned and walked off stage like she'd left something there. Not a performance, but a piece of herself. And the room? It didn't erupt. Not right away. It sat, held, felt. Then slowly, hands came together. Soft at first, then stronger. Then everyone. Some stood, some didn't. But every face watched her leave like they'd just witnessed something they didn't quite have words for. Backstage, Maddox was waiting. She didn't say, "Good job." Didn't say brilliant or stunning or anything that could fit on a trophy. She just placed a hand on Zariah's shoulder and said, "You told the truth." Zariah nodded. "That's all I wanted." That night, back home, she opened her sketchbook, slipped the showcase program inside the front pocket. Then, on a blank page, she wrote, "No stage lights, no praise, no spotlight needed, just truth, played loud enough to be heard. Because not every performance needs applause. Some just need to be remembered." And Zariah, she didn't play for Fletcher. She didn't play for approval. She played to reclaim the sound herself. And everyone who'd ever been told to stay in the back row. The Monday after the Civic Center showcase came without fanfare. There was no banner strung across the school's entrance, no email blast, no mention in the morning announcements. But something had shifted. It was in the way students looked at her now. More direct, more curious, less filtered through rumor. It was in the silence that fell when she walked into room 104. Not awkward silence, not judgment, recognition. They knew. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the history, but enough. Enough to understand that Zariah Miles no longer sat at the back of the room because she was small. She sat there because it was hers. Mr. Fletcher, of course, said nothing. He never acknowledged the showcase, not her performance, not the fact that several of his students had shared the video clip that was already gaining quiet traction on local music forums. Not the fact that even the school's arts newsletter had published a short blurb titled, "Local student closed the civic showcase with soulful Shostakovich." He didn't congratulate her. He didn't even look her way. But that in itself said everything. Because when people lose control, they don't always lash out. Sometimes they erase. Zariah watched as he stood at the front of the classroom, calling out names for the spring concert roster. She knew what was coming before he reached her row. First chairs, Marcus, Chloe, Lonnie. He skipped her. No solo slot. No lead part. No acknowledgement. Just a name left off the page. Again. But this time it didn't sting. It didn't feel like rejection. Because Zariah finally understood something she hadn't been ready to believe before. You don't need to be on the list to be in the room. You don't need a title to own your voice. You don't need permission to be undeniable. The school heard the whispers. They always did. And when enough students and teachers asked why the most talented violinist at Meriwether wasn't being featured in the concert, when a music teacher from another school emailed the principal directly after attending the Civic Center performance, change started to rattle the edges of the institution. Not loud, but steady, like a violin string tuning itself back into tension. The notice came by Friday, folded into Fletcher's inbox like any other memo from administration. Effective immediately, Mr. Fletcher will step down from his role coordinating the spring showcase. A new selection panel will oversee the performance order. No dramatic meeting, no public fallout, just a quiet removal, the kind reserved for those who'd overplayed their hand and underestimated who was watching. Zariah heard the news from Ms. Reyes. The counselor didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply passed her in the hallway and said, "I guess even silent notes hit when you play them right." Zariah smiled, but only for a second, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. About what happens when you're no longer afraid to be seen. In the weeks that followed, something changed in room 104. Fletcher still taught, still handed out sheet music, still tapped his baton like a heartbeat desperate for control. But his voice had dulled. The edge of it, the authority behind it, it no longer filled the space. Because the space had started listening to someone else. Younger students asked Zariah for help with difficult passages. A freshman named Maya followed her to her locker one afternoon, clutching a viola like a lifeline. "I've been trying to learn your Shostakovich run from the video," she said breathlessly. "It's insane. I mean, the phrasing." Zariah chuckled. "You free during lunch? Bring your sheet." And just like that, the back row became a classroom of its own. She wasn't trying to teach. She wasn't trying to lead. She just wasn't hiding anymore. And that alone was magnetic. One afternoon, she opened her locker and found another note, folded tight, wedged between her folders. No name, just 5 words. "You made room for me." She held it for a long time, then slid it between the pages of her sketchbook, right beside the first flyer, the audition list, the civic program, and all the other paper truths she collected since her first day at Meriwether. It was starting to look less like a notebook and more like a record, not what they tried to take from her, but of what she refused to let go. The spring concert arrived. Zariah wasn't first chair, but she didn't need to be. She stood beside her section, not in front, not behind, and played with the same clarity, the same fire, the same truth. She didn't look for Fletcher's reaction. She didn't need his approval, because the applause wasn't the validation. The playing was. The music, the kind that couldn't be muted, misquoted, or misfiled, was the win. After the final piece, a group of parents came over. One mother shook her hand, eyes glistening. "I don't know much about classical music," she said, "but I know what heart sounds like. And you play with heart." Zariah thanked her, then excused herself quietly, walking outside into the early dusk. The air was cool, alive, like spring had finally caught up. That night, on the balcony of their apartment, her mom joined her with 2 mugs of tea. No words for a while, just city noise, breeze, and the quiet settling of something big having passed. Then her mom said, "They couldn't stop your song." Zariah looked out over the rooftops, where streetlights blinked like low stars. "They tried, but you kept playing anyway." Zariah smiled. "I wasn't playing for them." Because that was the truth. Fletcher could exclude her from chairs and programs and solo lists, but he couldn't unhear what the room had heard. Couldn't untell the story she wrote in strings. Couldn't cut her from the melody. Not anymore. Zariah didn't play to be famous. She played to remind us that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's the overture to a symphony no one dares interrupt. Don't let it end here. Tap like, not just for Zariah, but for every young artist waiting in the back row. Subscribe so you never miss a story that dares to play truth louder than fear. And share this video with someone who's forgotten they don't need a spotlight to shine. Because sometimes, one note, one girl, one choice to speak quietly can change an entire room. And maybe the next room is yours.